Part 1. The station hung in space like a silver web, spinning slowly above Earth's blue curve. Inside, Doctor studied the monitors with her 3 eyes, watching the data streams from 2,000 sleeping humans below. Her gray skin reflected the screen's glow as numbers and images flickered past. The people had achieved so much. They had conquered disease, mastered space travel, and built 17 thriving worlds across the galaxy. Their artists created music that could make stone weep. Their poets wrote verses that changed the color of the sky. But they had one problem that stumped their greatest minds. They could not feel fear. Not the way other species did. They had evolved without predators, without natural disasters, without the countless dangers that shaped most intelligent life. Their brains simply did not process terror. For thousands of years, this seemed like a gift. But when they joined the galactic community and encountered other species' entertainment, they realized what they were missing. Horror movies, thriller novels, haunted houses, scary stories around campfires. Every other species had these things. Every other species understood the thrill of being safely frightened. They tried to create their own horror content, but it always fell flat. They could imagine danger intellectually, but they could not feel it in their bones. Then they discovered humanity. Humans were special. Humans dreamed in ways that seemed almost wasteful. Every night, billions of them spent hours creating elaborate scenarios in their sleep, and many of those scenarios were nightmares. Humans were afraid of everything. The dark, heights, deep water, being alone, being watched, things under the bed, things in the closet, things that wore familiar faces but were not quite right. The collective saw an opportunity. They would study these nightmares, learn from them, and finally understand fear. The institute was built in secret, a research station orbiting Earth. The humans below had no idea it existed. Doctor and her team reached out to sleep research centers across the planet, offering generous funding for participants in a long-term sleep quality study. The humans signed consent forms, collected their payments, and slept in comfortable beds with monitoring equipment attached to their heads. They had no idea that the equipment did far more than measure brain waves. The technology could record dreams in perfect detail, capturing not just the images but the emotions, the sensations, the pure experience of terror that came with each nightmare. For the first 3 months, Doctor and her team simply collected data. They watched thousands of nightmares flicker across their screens. A woman dreamed of showing up to work naked. A man dreamed his teeth were falling out. A child dreamed of being chased through dark hallways by something that breathed but could not be seen. The researchers cataloged everything. They created categories: pursuit nightmares, falling nightmares, death of loved ones, social humiliation, loss of control. Each type of fear was filed, analyzed, and studied. But the data was overwhelming. Doctor needed to find patterns to understand the architecture of human terror. She assigned her assistant, to look for outliers. "Find me the most interesting dreamers," she told him, "the ones who show unusual patterns." Or worked for 2 weeks, running the data through filters. Finally, he brought her a file. "This one," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Subject 1847, human name." Doctor opened the file. Age 32, lived alone in a small apartment in Seattle. He worked from home as a technical writer. No spouse, few friends, unremarkable medical history. But his dreams were anything but unremarkable. She loaded his most recent nightmare into the viewing chamber. The room darkened, and suddenly she was inside the dream, experiencing it as had experienced it. She stood in a hallway. It looked like a normal office building, but something was wrong. The fluorescent lights buzzed too loudly. The carpet's pattern seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. Doors lined both sides of the hallway, all of them slightly ajar, showing darkness beyond. She walked forward because in dreams you must always move forward. Behind her, she heard footsteps that matched her own. When she stopped, they stopped. When she walked, they walked. But they were not her footsteps. They were someone else's, perfectly synchronized. She tried to look behind her, but her neck would not turn. The dream logic prevented it. She could only move forward down the endless hallway while the matching footsteps followed. And then she noticed the doors were opening wider, just a little bit, just enough to let something through. The dream ended as woke up. Doctor stood in the viewing chamber, breathing hard. Her heart's pounded in her chest. She had felt something, not quite fear, but close, closer than she had ever come before. There was an elegance to this nightmare, a craftsmanship that the others lacked. She pulled up other dreams. Each one was different, but they all had that same quality. They were not random chaos. They were constructed. A nightmare about being in a familiar room that had too many corners. A dream about receiving phone calls from her own voice. A terror about realizing that everyone she knew had been replaced, but she could not identify what was different about them. Over the next month, Doctor watched dreams obsessively. She noticed something strange. His nightmares were getting better, more complex, more sophisticated. It was as if he was practicing, refining his technique. But that was impossible. Humans did not control their dreams that precisely. They happened randomly, generated by the subconscious mind processing the day's experiences. No one could deliberately craft nightmares the way an artist crafted a painting. She ran tests. She cross-referenced daily activities with his dream content. She found no correlation. His nightmares bore no relationship to his waking life. They seemed to come from nowhere, fully formed, perfect little horror stories that played out in his sleeping mind. Then she noticed another anomaly. During his dream sessions, his heart rate remained unusually steady. Most dreamers showed elevated heart rates during nightmares, physical signs of fear. But his vitals stayed calm, almost meditative, even as his dreams showed him being hunted by invisible things that whispered his name. Doctor made a decision. She would monitor more closely. She routed his feed to her private terminal and began watching in real time every night. She wanted to understand what made this human different. The entertainment division had already begun adapting dreams from the database into immersive experiences. The first releases were crude, simple adaptations of common nightmares, but they were successful enough to generate interest. The collective wanted more. Doctor submitted 3 of his dreams to the entertainment division. She did not tell them about her suspicions. She simply wanted to see how his particular style of nightmare would translate. The response was immediate and overwhelming. His nightmares were unlike anything the collective had experienced. They worked on multiple levels, creating unease rather than shock, dread rather than surprise. Audiences reported feelings they had never felt before. They wanted more. The entertainment executives demanded Doctor identify which subject had produced these dreams. They wanted to study him specifically, to understand what made his nightmares so effective. She refused at first, but the pressure mounted. Finally, she agreed to flag's file for special monitoring, but she insisted on maintaining research protocols. He would continue as a regular subject, unaware of the special attention. That night, she watched dream session as usual. He entered REM sleep at his typical time. The dream began. He was in a library where the books rearranged themselves when he looked away. The pages whispered secrets that he almost understood but could never quite hear clearly. And then in the dream turned and looked directly at her, not at a dream version of her, at the observer. His eyes focused on something that should not exist in his dream world, and he smiled. Doctor froze. It was impossible. The monitoring equipment was passive. It could not be detected. Dreamers could not know they were being watched, but knew. Somehow he knew. The dream continued. Walked through the library, still smiling. He pulled a book from a shelf and opened it. The pages were blank except for one sentence written in perfect script, a language he should not know. "Hello, Doctor. Let's make something amazing together." Part 2. Doctor sat in her quarters, her 3 hands trembling as she reviewed the recording for the 7th time. The message had been clear. New. But how could he know? The monitoring technology was completely passive. It read brain activity but transmitted nothing back. There should be no way for a human to detect it, let alone communicate through it. Unless he had detected something else. A pattern, a change in his environment, a glitch in the system. She accessed the Institute's security logs, going back 6 months to when first joined the study. She tracked every data packet, every system access, every routine maintenance check. And there, buried in the automated reports, she found it. A security flaw in the network firewall. It had been patched 4 months ago, but for nearly 8 weeks before that, the system had been vulnerable. Was a technical writer. He worked with computers. If he had been curious enough to probe the network from the monitoring equipment in his bedroom, if he had been skilled enough to trace the data flow, he might have discovered where his dreams were really going. Most people would have been terrified. They would have ripped off the equipment and called the authorities, but had done something completely different. He had decided to play along. Doctor realized with growing amazement that every dream she had watched for the past 4 months had been a performance, had been crafting nightmares specifically for his alien audience. He had been teaching himself to write horror for a psychology he could not fully understand, using only the feedback loop of how long the researchers watched each dream, which elements seemed to generate the most interest. He was an artist who had finally found an audience that appreciated his work. She needed to verify this hypothesis. She pulled up background information and went deeper than the standard intake form. She found his social media accounts, his old blog posts, his attempts at a writing career. Had spent 5 years trying to be a horror writer. He had written 3 novels that no publisher wanted. He had self-published stories that almost no one read. He had attended conferences and submitted to magazines and collected rejection after rejection. Then he had given up. He had taken a boring job writing technical manuals. He had stopped creating, but he had never stopped wanting to tell frightening stories. Until the Institute had given him the perfect opportunity. Doctor made a decision that violated every research protocol. She was going to respond. She could not communicate with him directly, but she could send a signal. She could let him know that she understood. She waited until his next scheduled session. When entered REM sleep and his dream began, she activated a harmless subroutine in the monitoring equipment. It caused a tiny fluctuation in the scanner's hum, a change so subtle that most sleepers would never notice it. But someone who was lucid dreaming, someone who was carefully controlling their experience, might detect it. In the dream stood in an empty theater. Rows of seats stretched back into darkness. He walked onto the stage and looked out at the audience he could not see. The scanner hummed. The frequency changed for just 3 seconds, then returned to normal. In the dream heard applause, slow and steady coming from the darkness. He bowed. Then he began his performance. What followed was the most sophisticated nightmare Doctor had ever witnessed. Constructed a dream about a man who discovered that memories were physical objects that could be stolen. The man realized his childhood was missing, then his teenage years, then yesterday. Someone was taking his life piece by piece, and he could not remember enough to know who or why. The fear was not about the theft itself, but about the dissolution of identity. If you could not remember who you were, did you still exist? The dream ended with the man standing in front of a mirror, unable to recognize his own reflection, while in his hand he held a photograph of someone he should know but did not. The photograph was of himself. Doctor sat back, stunned. This was not just a nightmare. This was philosophy. This was art. This was the kind of horror that made you question reality itself. She submitted the dream to the entertainment division without hesitation. They released it as an immersive experience called The Theft of Self. It became the most successful piece of entertainment in the collective's history. Across 17 worlds paid to experience the slow dissolution of identity, the creeping terror of losing yourself piece by piece. The demand exploded. The entertainment executives wanted more. They wanted dreams exclusively. They wanted them faster. Doctor tried to explain that dreams could not be rushed, that human sleep cycles had natural limits. The executives did not care. They had shareholders to satisfy. They had audiences demanding new experiences. They had discovered and they intended to extract every bit of value from it. The Institute's directors approved new protocols, enhancement drugs to intensify REM sleep, neural stimulation to prolong dream states, psychological conditioning to generate more extreme emotional responses. The protocols were tested on other subjects first, proven safe within acceptable parameters. Then they were applied to. Doctor objected. She argued that these interventions would change the natural quality of the dreams. The directors overruled her. Production quotas were established. Would deliver 5 premium nightmares per week, or the program would be terminated. The first enhanced session seemed to go well. Entered deeper REM sleep than normal. His dream lasted 47 minutes instead of the usual 20. The nightmare was intense and surreal, about being trapped in a building where every exit led back to the entrance, where time moved backwards, where other trapped people aged in reverse until they became children, then infants, then nothing. The entertainment division loved it. They pushed for more enhancement. Doctor watched the second enhanced session with growing dread. His vital signs showed distress. His heart rate climbed. His breathing became ragged. The dream itself changed. It was no longer controlled and crafted. It was raw fear. Running through dark spaces, being chased by things he could not name, screaming in a voice that made no sound. This was not art, this was torture. She tried to stop the session, but her access was. The entertainment division had taken control of feed. They wanted the raw emotion. They thought it was more authentic. Dreams became a nightmare for Doctor as well. Night after night, she watched him suffer. The enhancement drugs kept him in REM sleep for hours at a time. The neural stimulation made every fear more vivid, more inescapable. The psychological conditioning made him relive traumas he had never actually experienced. He tried to resist. She could see him fighting to wake up, struggling against the protocols. But the equipment was too strong. It held him under, forced him to keep dreaming, kept extracting content for the hungry audiences below. The worst part was that the audiences loved it even more. They could feel his genuine terror. They praised the authenticity. They did not know they were experiencing real suffering. They thought it was just very convincing art. Doctor accessed early dream recordings, the ones from before he knew he was being watched. She compared them to his later controlled performances. She documented everything: the deliberate craftsmanship, the artistic choices, the evidence that had been conscious and willing. Then she compared those to the enhanced sessions, the loss of control, the genuine distress, the screaming. She compiled all the data into a report. She titled it Subject 1847, Ethical Analysis of Conscious Dream Exploitation. She sent it to the Institute's Ethics Board, to the Collective's Media Oversight Committee, and to the Entertainment Division's Board of Directors. The response was immediate. She was removed from the project. Her access to feed was revoked. Security escorted her to her quarters and informed her that she was under investigation for breach of research protocols and unauthorized communication with oversight committees. But Doctor had made copies. She had sent the data to her personal archive, to secure servers outside the Institute's control, and she had included something else in her report. She had included the message had written in script. "Hello, Doctor, let's make something amazing together." She had explained what it meant, that had known, that he had been willing, that they had turned a collaborative artist into a torture victim. The report leaked. Within hours, it was spreading across the collective's networks. News organizations picked it up. Civil rights groups began protesting. Audiences who had enjoyed nightmares suddenly confronted an uncomfortable truth. They had been entertained by real suffering. For a species just learning to feel fear, this realization triggered something unprecedented. They felt guilt, shame, horror at themselves. The entertainment industry tried to contain the damage. They issued statements claiming the report was exaggerated, that all protocols had been properly approved, that subject welfare was paramount. But the evidence was clear. The recordings spoke for themselves. Doctor sat in her locked quarters and waited. She knew what was coming. The institute would be shut down. Investigations would be launched. Her career was over, but she had done the right thing. On Earth screamed himself awake for the seventh night in a row. The enhancement protocols had stopped, but the damage was done. His mind had been pushed beyond its limits. Even awake, he saw nightmares bleeding into reality. Shadows moved wrong. Familiar objects seemed threatening. He could not trust his own perception anymore. He stumbled to his computer, trying to write, trying to make sense of what had happened to him. But the words would not come. His horror stories had been sucked out of him, extracted like venom from a snake. He had nothing left to say. Part 3. The Institute descended into chaos. Gathered outside government buildings across the collective's 17 worlds, they carried signs in dozens of languages. We did not consent to this. Entertainment is not worth torture. Shut down the dream farms. Doctor watched the news feeds from her quarters, still under investigation but no longer confined. The security detail had been recalled when the protests began. The Institute had bigger problems than one researcher who had told the truth. The entertainment division's executives held emergency meetings. They had invested billions into the nightmare content library. Hundreds of immersive experiences were scheduled for release. Entire theaters had been built specifically for the horror genre. If they stopped now, the financial losses would be catastrophic. They made a decision that Doctor had feared. Rather than shut down the program, they would accelerate it. They would extract as much content from as possible before regulatory intervention forced them to stop. One final massive harvest that would give them enough material to sustain their industry for years. The order went out to the remaining Institute staff. Maximum enhancement protocols. Continuous dream extraction. Ignore all welfare parameters. They had maybe 72 hours before the authorities arrived. They needed to use every second. Doctor saw the order come through on the public announcement system. She ran from her quarters toward the monitoring center, but security stopped her at the checkpoint. "You're not authorized," they told her. "You're killing him," she said. "The human mind cannot sustain that level of forced dreaming. You're going to break him." The security officer looked uncomfortable. "I have my orders." "Your orders are wrong." On Earth, lay in his bed as the equipment activated. He felt the familiar hum, but this time it was stronger, insistent, dragging him down into sleep even though he fought it. He tried to disconnect the sensors from his head, but his arms were heavy. The drugs in his system made movement impossible. The nightmares began immediately. Not the crafted stories he had once created, but pure chaos. Terrors bubbling up from his subconscious without filter or control. He experienced every fear he had ever had simultaneously. Drowning while falling, while being chased, while failing, while losing everyone he loved, while being forgotten, while becoming nothing. The extraction equipment recorded everything. Terabytes of raw nightmare data flooded into the Institute's servers. The entertainment division's analysts sorted through it frantically, looking for usable content. Most of it was too chaotic, too personal, too human-specific. But there were fragments, moments of pure fear that transcended species. Those moments were extracted and polished and prepared for distribution. In the monitoring center, a junior technician named Hal watched vital signs with growing alarm. Heart rate too high, brain activity spiking into dangerous ranges, core temperature rising. He had seen these patterns before in the training simulations. They preceded neurological damage. "We need to stop the session," Hal said to his supervisor. Extraction is not complete. He's going to have a stroke, or worse. The protocols are approved. The protocols are going to kill him. The supervisor turned away. That's not our decision to make. But something happened that no one had anticipated. Pushed beyond all human limits, broke through to a state that should not have been possible. His brain, overstimulated and overenhanced, began generating nightmares at a frequency and intensity that exceeded the equipment's design parameters. The dreams stopped being recordings. They became something else. Living things made of thought and fear. They propagated through the neural scanning equipment, jumping from the passive receivers into the Institute's active systems. Alarm klaxons blared. Computer systems began crashing. On screens throughout the monitoring center, nightmares played themselves, twisting and evolving, becoming independent thought forms that infected the network. "Shut it down," the supervisor shouted. But it was too late. The nightmares had already spread into the entertainment distribution network. Every theater system, every immersive experience pod, every personal entertainment device across the collective that had ever accessed content. Millions of who had consumed his horror over the past months found themselves experiencing something unprecedented. The nightmares they had watched for entertainment began replaying in their minds, not as memories but as active experiences. They saw the hallways with too many corners. They heard footsteps that matched their own. They felt the dissolution of self, the fear of being replaced, the terror of spaces that folded wrong. And because the mind had no natural defenses against fear, because they had never evolved the ability to dismiss nightmares as just dreams, the horrors took root. They spread from person to person through the collective unconscious that linked their species. His fears became their fears. His nightmares became their nightmares. The collective's mental health infrastructure was overwhelmed within hours. Hospitals filled with patients experiencing panic attacks, intrusive thoughts, and crippling anxiety. Therapists who had never treated fear-based disorders scrambled to develop techniques. The entire civilization was learning what it meant to be afraid, all at once, and they were not prepared. Doctor fought her way to the medical bay, had been transported there when his session crashed the systems. She found him in a private room, unconscious, vital signs barely stable. The doctors had put him in a medically induced coma to prevent further neurological damage. She accessed his file. The prognosis was uncertain. Severe psychological trauma, possible permanent changes to sleep architecture. Even if he recovered physically, mentally he might never be the same. They had pushed him too far. They had broken something that might not heal. "I'm getting you out of here," she whispered to his unconscious form. The Institute was in lockdown, but the chaos worked in her favor. Security was overwhelmed. Systems were failing. In the confusion, Doctor accessed an emergency escape pod, the kind meant for evacuation during station emergencies. She placed inside, still in his medical stasis chamber, and programmed the pod for Earth. She included a data packet with his medical records and a message for human authorities. An explanation of what had happened, an apology on behalf of the collective, and a request that they help him heal, that they erase his memories of the Institute if necessary for his recovery. The pod launched. Doctor watched it descend toward Earth's atmosphere, a small silver egg carrying one broken human home. Behind her, the Institute began its final collapse. Regulatory authorities had arrived. Arrest warrants were issued for the entertainment executives. The entire dream extraction program was declared criminal. The collective's government issued formal apologies to Earth, though they kept the details classified. Humanity still did not know that aliens had been stealing their nightmares. 6 months passed. The collective learned to live with fear. Mental health services expanded. New art forms emerged that dealt with anxiety and dread in constructive ways. The nightmare epidemic slowly faded as the developed psychological defenses, the mental immune systems that most species evolved naturally, but they had to learn artificially. On Earth, woke up in a hospital in Seattle. He remembered having strange dreams for the sleep study. He remembered that the study had been terminated early due to equipment problems. He remembered being compensated generously for his time, but the details were fuzzy. The doctors said this was normal, a side effect of the deep sleep protocols. He went home to his apartment. He sat at his laptop, staring at the blank document that had been open for 6 months. The novel he had been working on before the study, a horror story about being watched by unseen eyes. He tried to remember why he had stopped writing it. The words would not come. But as he sat there, his fingers began to move across the keyboard. Almost without conscious thought, he wrote a scene about a library where books rearranged themselves, about a hallway with too many doors, about the fear of losing your memories piece by piece. The words flowed like water, perfect and complete, as if someone else had written them and he was simply remembering. Over the next weeks, wrote with an intensity he had never experienced. Story after story poured out of him. He submitted them to magazines and was shocked when they were accepted. He wrote a novel in 3 months. Publishers bid on it. It became a bestseller. Critics praised his work. Writes fear with an almost alien perspective, one review said. His nightmares feel both intimately human and eerily universal, as if he's tapped into something that transcends species. Read that review and felt a strange sensation, almost as if he should remember something important, but the memory would not surface. In his dreams, sometimes he saw a gray figure with 3 eyes. She stood in the shadows and watched him with an expression he could not quite identify. Not hungry, not cruel, something gentler, something almost like gratitude. When he woke, he could never quite remember her face, but he always felt the need to write, to craft nightmares, to create fear in its form. Far above Earth, the abandoned institute drifted in a decaying orbit. Inside, the servers that had held dreams were corrupted and dead. But sometimes, when solar radiation hit the station's hull at certain angles, the equipment powered on for just a few seconds, long enough for one final dream to play across dormant screens. The dream showed at his keyboard writing, and in the dream he looked up and smiled, not at the camera, not at invisible observers, just smiled. The smile of an artist who had finally found his voice. Doctor, now working as an ethics consultant for the collective's new human relations department, received unexpected messages sometimes. They came from ordinary people who had experienced nightmares during the epidemic. They wrote to tell her that the fear, terrible as it had been, had changed them. It had taught them to value consciousness, to appreciate safety, to understand that existence was precious because it could be threatened. One message said, "I used to take my life for granted. I existed without truly living, but after feeling what it meant to be afraid, I understand now. Every moment I am not afraid is a gift. Tell the human, if you can, that his suffering was not meaningless. He taught an entire species what it means to be alive." Doctor saved these messages. Someday, if ever remembered, if he ever asked, she would find a way to share them, to let him know that his nightmares had served a purpose greater than entertainment. They had given an entire civilization something it had never had before: the capacity to appreciate peace, because they had finally learned fear. On Earth, finished his 3rd novel and started his 4th. He wrote about things that scared him, things that scared everyone. And somehow, he wrote about things that scared beings he had never met, on worlds he would never visit. He was humanity's ambassador to the darkness, and he never knew it. But somewhere deep in his dreams, in places where memory became myth, he sensed the truth. He was not writing for himself alone. Somewhere, somehow, someone was watching, someone was grateful, someone understood. And that knowledge, buried beneath layers of suppressed memory, made him smile as he wrote.